Let's talk about Egypt, the discoveries that shocked the world.
好啦，我哋而家講講呢個埃及點樣震撼呢個世界呢？
I was saying that the Scottish painter David Roberts went to Egypt in 1838.
就喺1838年呢一個嘅英國嘅繪畫家嚟到呢個埃及嘅地方。
That was nearly 200 years ago.
咁差唔多有200年咁耐咯。
When Egypt had not basically been discovered.
嗰陣時咧，我哋大家都唔知道有呢個埃及呢一個古國嘅存在。
And he painted much of what he saw at that time.
咁佢盡量咧就係將佢當時見到咧繪畫出嚟。
For example, this is Abu Simbel depicting Ramses II.
呢個咧就係畫咗呢個當時嘅皇帝啊。
But notice something. You see that the sand that is covering the lower legs of Ramses II.
大家留意下咧，佢喺腳下邊咧有一層嘅沙係堆積住嘅。
Of course, that has been cleared out, and so he painted what he saw 200 years ago.
但而家當然係清除咗啦，但係嗰陣時嘅畫就係200年前，當時係有一堆沙嘅。
We get a glimpse of what Egypt was like at that time.
咁大家可以想象明白當時200年前當時嘅情況係咁樣。
Look at this crown, the column crowns here.
咁你大家睇下呢度係色彩繽紛嘅喎。
Look at the color.
望一望啲顏色咧。
You can't see that anymore. The color has been faded, but 200 years ago you could still see it.
但200年前呢係有呢個顏色，當然今日去到咧已經冇晒啦。
Egypt is a country like no other.
呢個埃及國家咧就唔似其他地方啊。
Egypt is called the land of the Nile because the Nile gave it life.
原來佢叫做係尼羅河之地，就係尼羅河俾佢有生命。佢哋認為
It's a desert country that you could not really do anything with except along the banks of the river.
你諗下啦，佢喺一個沙漠地方，除咗靠呢個水源之外咧，佢哋冇辦法生存嘅。
Here's a satellite picture of Egypt, and look at how desert, everything is desert except for the Nile.
大家睇下呢一個嘅係呢一個嘅衛星嘅圖片，全部都係沙漠，只有一條河啫。
Of course, as you know, the Nile is the longest river in the world.
你知道啦，呢個係全世界最長嘅一條河，叫尼羅河。
About 6,500 kilometers long.
有6500公里咁長嘅。
And it begins in middle Africa and it goes through 11 countries before it gets to the delta.
咁你哋睇下，原來佢由非洲嘅中部開始，經過11個國家，直到去呢個三角洲。
Of course, Egypt is known for those ancient pyramids.
當然我哋知道啦，古金字塔係佢哋當地最出名嘅。
The only surviving remnant of the seven ancient wonders of the world.
佢哋今日咧就唯一呢個世界7大奇蹟裏邊唯一存留嘅。
There were not just 3 or 4 of these. There is 138 as of a few years ago.
咁你知道啦，前幾年之前佢哋計過，一共係有成138個咁多嘅金字塔。
Egypt has fantastic treasures.
佢哋好奇妙嘅珍寶喎。
Look at the beauty of this scarab seal.
你諗下呢一個係一個嘅印章嚟嘅，幾美麗咧。
This represented a god, the god Heifer.
原來呢個係代表佢哋所拜嘅神嚟嘅喎，係一個甲蟲嘅神嚟嘅。
And of course, this beetle, the dung beetle, he rolled a perfect ball from mud.
原來呢一個嘅甲蟲咧，佢哋會有啲嘅排泄物變成一個好似個波形狀。
And the Egyptians said that showed that he was the creator of the sun, the perfect sphere in the sky.
哦，咁樣咧，佢哋埃及人就話呢一個咁嘅圓形嘅波咧，就好似一個太陽咁樣。
This is a famous picture from Egypt, Abu Simbel.
呢個就係阿寶辛貝嘅神殿啦。
Most people think that this is Ramses, and then one of these must be his wife, Nefertiti.
大家諗下啦，佢哋認為咧呢個就係當時嘅皇帝嘅神像嚟嘅。
No such luck. It's Ramses all the way through. All 4 of them is the same guy.
佢諗住咧，其中有一個可能嘅太太，4個之中，但唔係4個都係佢嚟嘅。
Many of these pharaohs had big egos, and so one of them was not enough.
哇！佢話點得啊？一個唔夠自大，要4個神像先威水。
Here's the temple of Deir al-Bahari.
哈謝布蘇廟啦，係咪？
It's a funerary temple. This is the place of burial of one of the queens we're going to talk about tonight.
嗱，呢一個咧就係一個墓穴，我哋將會同佢講到嘅啦，係一個埋葬咗個女王嘅。
And it is very possible that this queen, Hatshepsut, is actually connected with the Bible story in the book of Exodus.
咁裏邊埋葬個女王咧，我哋認為非常之有可能就係同聖經裏邊記載到嘅呢一個嘅女王。
The ancient Egyptians built a civilization to be remembered.
原來埃及文化佢哋建立咧，佢希望以後啲人可以記得到佢哋。
They had wonderful artists. They had great architects.
佢哋有好壯大嘅呢個建築等等。
It was the most sophisticated civilization for several hundred years.
幾百年之內咧，佢哋都係一個好優秀嘅呢個文化。
I mentioned that there are 138 pyramids in Egypt.
頭先我哋講過咧，有138座金字塔唔多。
Of course, the most famous ones are the Giza pyramids, which is right outside Cairo.
原來呢一個喺呢個開羅出邊嘅吉薩金字塔係
You can see in this picture how close the city is to the pyramids.
你睇下啦，原來個城市同呢個金字塔好近嘅啫。
These pyramids are about 4,000 years old.
差唔多有成4000年咁耐啦。
In the Bible, Abraham is a key personage in the Old
原
Testament.
來呢度講到有一個叫做亞伯拉罕，就係一個舊約聖經裏邊一個重要人物嚟嘅。
Three world religions claim Abraham: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism.
咁我哋知道啦，猶太教啦、基督教同埋呢一個嘅回教咧，都引佢做佢哋嘅祖先
And
喎。
he lived 4,000 years ago.
原來當時佢係4000年前，佢已經喺嗰度啦。
Abraham did not originate from Palestine. He came from Babylon.
但係佢嚟自邊度咧？原來係嚟自巴比倫，唔係巴勒斯坦嘅地方。
So on that journey, which would take him up the crescent, going north and then south to Palestine, he must have seen those pyramids.
所以大家想象下，佢由呢個巴比倫地方咁樣兜個圈嚟到，一定相信佢當時係見過嗰啲金字塔嘅。
And so his grandson, Jacob, who moved his family to Egypt at a time of famine.
咁當時咧由饑荒啦，呢一個佢嘅孫雅各咧就搬咗去埃及地方住啊。
Here are the three pyramids, the pyramid of Cheops, of Khephren, and Mycerinus.
大家圖畫裏邊見到咧有3座嘅金字塔啦。
Obviously named after each of the pharaohs that the pyramids were built after.
原來呢幾個咧都係命名於當時嘅法老王佢哋起嘅。
Each of these large pyramids involved about 2.3 million blocks, large blocks.
你諗下啦，原來當時係超過230萬嘅石頭咧起呢個金字塔。
Each of them weighed between 1,000 and 2,500 kilos.
而每一個石頭咧，佢重係1000到2500公斤咁重嘅。
And you wonder, how can you move that in ancient history? How could they do it?
咁你諗下點樣將個咁大石頭運到去起金字塔咧？
The pyramid of Cheops is the tallest one. It is almost 150 meters
咁
tall.
其中一個最高嘅咧就差唔多有成150米咁高喎。
It covers about over 5 hectares.
佔地咧差唔多5公畝咁大啊！
So it covers a very wide footprint.
哇，真係喎，佔地好大喎。
Now, this is something we're familiar with. The HSBC building in Hong Kong is about 150 meters tall.
大家諗下啦，喺我哋匯豐銀行150米咁高係咪咧？
So imagine if we had a pyramid in Hong Kong, it would be as tall as that building.
你諗下，如果我哋真係香港有個金字塔咧，由匯豐銀行咁高嘅，
But it would cover quite a territory in that section of Hong Kong.
但佔地好大啦，就佔咗香港好多嘅面積㗎個金字塔。
Khephren is the second tallest pyramid, and you can see at the top of the pyramid the limestone casing.
你見到咧，呢個就第2高嘅，但喺上面嗰陣時，淨係見到啲石灰嘅外層啦。
Many people think that's unusual, that's unique to that pyramid.
覺得好特別啊！呢個金字塔上面咁嘅顏色
The
嘅。
truth is that all the pyramids basically had that cover, and so it made all the pyramids smooth.
其實原本嘅時候咧，根本成個金字塔都好似上面咁尖頂係咁平滑嘅。
The reason this is left, there is some of that casing left, is because robbers couldn't get that far up. And they kept stealing other, bricks and stones to build other things.
原來其他呢啲盜賊咧就係點啊？上面爬唔到咁高啊嘛，所以下邊啲石頭佢哋盡量拆得就拆啦。
We see here a preserved limestone casing. This is what it would look like, and this would cover all the rough edges of the pyramid.
咁你睇下呢個金字塔本身凹凸不平，其實原本咧就好似下邊嗰個咁樣嘅底部係好平滑，一直去到上面頂。
So the big question is, how did they build a pyramid without hydraulics and without some of the equipment we have today?
點解佢哋冇我哋今日嘅機械？點可以起到金字塔咁犀利咧？
The best information we have tells us that the Egyptians were pretty crafty, pretty resourceful.
原來佢哋當時佢哋有好多嘅資源，佢哋好聰明喎。佢點起咧？
The first thing they would do is that they would scrape an area all the way to bedrock until it was smooth.
佢哋咧就將個石頭咧就將嗰個好唔平滑嘅石頭將佢整成係好滑淨嘅。
A big area.
一個好大嘅地方，佢哋有一個好平
Then they
嘅
would
地方。
build a wall around that area.
跟住喺一個好平滑嘅地方咧，就旁邊起到啲牆壁啦。
And then they would flood the area with water.
喺呢一個圍住嘅地方，佢哋就將啲水放入去。
And they would bring these blocks on barges into that flooded area.
然後將其他啲石頭咧就搬入去呢一個嘅有水嘅圍牆裏
They
邊。
would build mud ramps that would go up higher and higher and higher upon the pyramid.
佢哋用呢個咁嘅水係將啲石頭搬入去，跟住咧有啲嘅斜度，將呢啲咁嘅石頭一直咁拖上去最高嘅地
So
方。
with a system of levees and pulleys, they would just drag those stones until they would put them in the right place.
佢哋一嚿一嚿咁樣慢慢由下邊咁將呢一個石頭有個斜坡上面咧，就係去到嗰個山頂上面。
But even the most important question may be this:
但
why did they do it?
但最大嘅問題就係點解佢要起金字塔咧？
Why build such large monuments to the dead?
點解要為一啲死嘅人要佢起個咁大嘅墓穴咧、紀念碑咧？
Dr. Kazel, please come and tell us a little bit about how the Egyptians felt about death, etc.
好啦，咁我哋請我呢個考古學家嚟解釋下點解咁做咧？
It's a privilege to be with you here this evening.
實在係我嘅榮譽，今晚可以喺度同大家分享。
It was a long trip,
係一個好漫長嘅旅程，
but I was really looking forward to it, and I'm glad I'm here.
但係我實在咧係好開心可以喺呢度同你哋分享。
When I think of Hong Kong, I think of enormous buildings.
當我諗到香港嘅時候，我就諗到嗰啲高樓大廈。
But when we think about the pyramids, the Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world for almost 4,000 years.
但係當我哋諗到金字塔嘅時候，就知道原來金字塔喺過往4000年嘅歷史裏邊都係最高嘅呢啲嘅建築物。
It wasn't until the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris that the record was broken.
直至到咧喺呢個巴黎嘅嗰個塔。
So why did they build these
Eiffel Tower.
buildings, as we asked a moment ago? Why was this so important to the early Egyptians in the 3rd dynasty in early Egyptian history?
點解埃及人要做呢啲金字塔呢？
Well, they were fascinated with the afterlife.
因為佢哋係對於人死後嘅生命係着迷。
Like so many other human beings around the world, they were fascinated with what happens after a person dies.
好似世界上都有好多人對於人死咗之後會係點樣係着迷。
And the Egyptians built this great idea of what takes place after the death
唔
of
係埃及
a
人
pharaoh.
佢嘅思想上邊咧，亦都係有一套好完整去嘅觀念。人死咗之後係點樣？
I brought something with me here today.
我喺呢度帶咗一個，
It is what you see here on the screen.
你可以睇到喺呢度喺嗰個熒光幕嗰度睇到啦，呢一個。
I bought this in Egypt some years ago.
咁咧我喺埃及好幾年前咧就遇上呢一幅咁嘅圖，咁就買咗落嚟。
It shows an ancient judgment scene where the deceased, the person who died, is being judged by the gods of Egypt.
咁喺呢度就講到一個人過咗身之後，就要俾嗰啲埃及嗰啲神咧去審判佢。
The heart
咁佢個心咧就攞出嚟，
is weighed against a feather.
咁就會同喺個天平嗰度咧稱一下，同嗰個一條羽毛嚟比較。
If the heart is heavier than the feather,
如果個心係重過嗰條羽毛嘅，
then the person did not live a just and truthful and compassionate life.
咁呢個人佢所過嘅生活咧，喺世上嘅時候咧，就唔係一個正直嘅人啦。
And that person's mummy would be swallowed up by this creature here.
咁嗰個人咧死後咧變成木乃伊之後咧，就會俾呢一隻怪獸咧就食咗落肚啦。
So the Egyptians spent a great deal of time thinking about the afterlife.
所以埃及人咧係經常對於呢個人死咗之後會係點樣咧，係
They
喺度
wondered
想
what would happen after death.
人死後係會點樣。
And they believed that if they lived a good life in this world, they would have a life after death.
佢哋相信，如果佢哋喺生存嘅時候活一個正直嘅人生咧，咁樣死後咧都會有一個好嘅。
As time went on, they developed other ideas.
咁時間過咗之後咧，埃及人咧就對呢個死後嘅生活嘅觀念咧又有所改變啦。
What we see here is a scene out of a tomb of Thutmose III.
咁你喺度睇到咧，呢個咧就喺其中一個埃及嘅王咧，佢出邊呢個牆嗰度咧有咁樣嘅雕刻喺度。
Here we see the scarab again that is leading the sun through the 12 hours of the day.
咁你睇到咧呢度咧就提到咧係時間點樣樣係控制12小時點樣樣過。
Here is the king on this ship moving across the waters.
咁呢度睇到咧喺另外呢邊咧就呢個王咧死後咧就點樣樣坐住佢嗰個奔葬嘅船咧過嚟啦。
He is moving from this life to the afterlife.
咁佢就由呢一個生命從一個角落就去到另一個。
And leading the king is the serpent.
咁咧帶領住呢個王進入呢個圖畫咧就係一條嘅蛇啦。
The serpent in ancient Egyptian ideology was the key to the afterlife.
咁咧喺埃及人嘅思想咧，呢個死後係點樣咧？就同呢條蛇咧係好有個關係。
Above the serpent's head in this picture, you can see the Ankh symbol.
咁你喺呢個蛇嘅頭上高咧，你就睇到佢畫咗嗰個咧叫做安卡或者安可嘅符號。
And the Ankh symbol was very significant.
呢個安卡或者安可嘅符號咧係非常之有意思嘅。
The Ankh was the symbol for eternal life.
呢個安卡咧就係一個符號，係代表一個永恆生命嘅代
The
表，
eternal breath of the deceased.
代表一個過咗身嘅人，佢可以永遠都仲可以喺嗰度咧係呼吸。
Now, the serpent that we see in ancient Egypt reminds us of a story that we find in the very first book of the Bible.
咁你可以聯想到呢一個埃及人佢嘅思想，呢個故事就諗起聖經裏邊都有類似咁樣嘅記載。
A serpent appears in the garden in the very beginning of the Bible story.
聖經講蛇就喺上帝所創造美好嘅呢個伊甸園裏邊出現。
The first woman is confronted by the serpent.
第一個被造嘅女人就同呢個蛇對話。
The book of Genesis says this.
喺創世記裏邊咁講。
Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will surely not die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God,
呢度講蛇對女人說：你們不一定死，因為神知道你們吃的日子，眼睛就明亮了，你們便如神，能知道善惡。
Genesis teaches that there was a serpent, and this serpent said the opposite that God had said to the first human beings.
喺聖經嘅創世記裏邊提到有一條蛇，呢條蛇所講嘅話同上帝所講嘅話對立。
This serpent in Genesis was apparently also a winged serpent.
喺呢個記錄裏邊呢條蛇咧都係有對翼嘅。
And it's very interesting that what the serpent says and what the serpent is depicted as is also seen here in this Egyptian painting on the tomb walls.
咁所以你可以想像到咧，聖經所講嘅咧，亦都喺呢一幅圖畫裏邊咧係有所表達咗出嚟。
We see a winged serpent.
你睇到一條蛇有對翼喺嗰度。
We see two eyes that are opened. Knowledge is being gained.
你睇到有一對眼睛喺嗰度明亮咗、開咗，分辨到善惡。
And holding the wings of the serpent is the god Atum, who is the creator god in ancient Egyptian mythology.
咁喺呢個翼之間所描繪嘅就係一位埃及嘅神，去管理生命嘅神。
This is what a very famous Egyptologist says about this scene.
呢個係一個對埃及文化研究好有學問嘅學者。
Against a background of stars stands a winged snake with two pairs of legs. A caption tells us, Death, the great God who made gods and man. Death is a necessary feature of the world of creation, that is, of existence in general. In other words, this person is saying, and this inscription is saying, that death was always present in this world, and death would always be present in this world. It was the creator of life.
呢度呢位作者講，在星空下站住一條帶有翅膀同兩對腳嘅蛇，有標題告訴我們，偉大的死亡之神，他創造了諸神和人類。一個死亡的化身被視為創造主，並繪聲繪影地灌輸一個思想。
So this is telling us that death was always part of this world, and that death was actually the creator of life, which is the very opposite of what the Bible says.
咁所以呢個作者所提到嘅理論咧，就係話死亡咧，似乎係永遠係喺我哋存在喺我哋之間，而死亡咧係帶出生命，咁就同咧聖經所講嘅係唔一樣。
So the Egyptians were fascinated with death. They spent a huge amount of resources in talking about death, in creating these mythologies about death, and even in building these great pyramids. But there came a time in Egyptian history where they stopped building pyramids, and when they started hiding the tombs of the kings in places that they would not be found.
咁埃及人咧，對於人死咗之後嘅生命係點樣咧？係十分之着迷，到咗一個地步咧，就建立呢啲咁多嘅所謂金字塔。但係過咗一段時間之後咧，佢哋又唔再做金字塔啦，就做一啲墳墓，將嗰啲王咧係收埋，唔好俾人揾到。
One of the most fascinating discoveries in Egyptian history was the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun.
咁最出名嘅一個咧揾到嘅墓咧，就係圖坦卡門墓。
Dr. Cluzet, tell us about this fascinating discovery, probably one of the greatest discoveries ever made in Egyptian history and in archaeology in general.
我哋請 Dr. Cluzet 嚟解釋下。
Thank you. This is a fascinating story, and many of you probably have read it.
大家可能聽過呢個故事喎，就係呢個圖坦卡門墓係點樣被發現嘅。
100 years ago, most of the tombs of the ancient pharaohs had been discovered or had been plundered.
其實大概係100年前嘅時候，大部分嘅法老王嘅墓都俾人掘開咗㗎啦。
But there was one pharaoh, a young pharaoh, who died when he was probably late teen, who had not been discovered.
但其中有一個比較後生啲嘅咧，就係10幾歲就過身啦。但呢個墓咧仲係未被發現嘅。
When that was discovered in 1922, it made news all over the place.
咁1922年被發現嘅時候咧，就出晒名咯
The archaeologist was Howard Carter, and he had been searching for that tomb for 6 years.
喎。然後呢個卡特呢個考古學家揾呢個墓揾咗6年咁耐啊。
His sponsor was Lord Carnarvon, who was funding the project.
咁被贊助呢個咧就叫卡拿封勳爵。
Carnarvon said, you're probably not going to find it. We're going to stop funding the project.
咁呢一個勳爵就話：嘿，睇你都揾唔到噶啦，都係停止呢一個咁嘅發掘好啦。
So Carter made a quick trip to England from Egypt and says, please give me one more year, just one more year.
佢即刻
I'm close to finding
即
it.
刻就快啲要揾翻呢個贊助人，俾多1年我一定會揾到噶啦。
And that's exactly what happened.
咁啊，真係發生咗咁嘅事咯
Part of the problem is that this was among the least prominent, and so it was difficult to find records where that might be.
噃。呢個因為係一個最唔突出嘅墓，所以咧就好難唔夠足夠資料去揾啦。
But they did find the tomb in the Valley of the Kings.
咁佢真係喺呢一個皇帝谷裏邊咧揾到呢一個墓穴喎。
And those tombs were designed in such a way that it was difficult to get to the actual place where the Pharaoh was buried and his goods were buried.
啊，原來咧好佢哋設計好特別嘅，你係好難揾到真正呢一個法老王埋葬嘅地方嘅。
They have built many false passageways and places where if robbers wanted to come, they would be lost or they would be trapped.
佢哋咧起到好似個迷宮咁喎，要有人嚟發掘嘅時候咧，就可能蕩失路啦等等。
They eventually got to the actual place of the burial of Tutankhamun.
終於咧去到呢笪地方啦。
And these are actual pictures from that time in 1922.
呢個就係1922年真正嗰陣時影到嘅相就係咁嘅喎。
And the discovery is famous because Carter was the first one who bored a hole through a small wall and hot air came out.
原來當時咧好特別喎，因為佢係親手去鑽咗個窿，而即刻有啲熱風係吹出嚟。
It almost snuffed away the light of the candle.
差唔多咧，連個蠟燭都吹熄啊！
But then he adjusted his eyes and he was able to see things that nobody had ever seen before, at least in the last 3,000 years.
啊，就係佢繼續咁樣教下佢個眼睇真啲，原來3000年裏邊係冇人發現嘅，就喺眼前出現咗。
There were people waiting behind, including his sponsor.
咁後邊咧排住好多人，包括佢贊咗個人，做咩企喺度唔喐咧佢？
And he was not saying anything. He was just enthralled, watching through that hole.
啊，原來佢一句都講唔出話，原來不停咁係定視喺呢個窿仔裏邊。
Finally, when Lord Carnarvon, he recorded, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?"
哇！嗰個贊助人話：有冇睇到嘢？有冇睇到嘢啊？
His answer was simple and comprehensive.
哇！佢嘅答案咧就好簡單，但係非常之全面
It
性啊！
was all I could do to get out the words, "Yes, wonderful thing."
我講係啊，好奇妙啊！
What did Carter see?
睇到咩咧？
Well, Carter, saw these are pictures from that time.
原來呢個就係當時見到嘅呢個圖片啊！
And you would think that this is a storage place that is in disarray.
啊，你以為係士多房係咪咧？
But there are very important things here.
你睇下裏邊有啲好重要嘅寶物喎。
You see treasure chests.
你見到呢一個嘅寶藏箱啦，
And you see bed rests, bedposts.
你見到呢個係放床嘅，
And you see all these other items that a Pharaoh would need for the afterlife.
啊，原來呢一紮嘢咧就係佢認為法老王死咗之後會用到嘅。
Here is a reproduction of what that might have looked like in those days.
後尾咧佢哋就係咁樣製作出嚟，原來當時係咁靚嘅。
One of the things that Carter said is that he saw a lot of gold.
哇！佢第一樣嘢就話好多金啊！
And there was a lot of gold. You have even sentinels, posting guard to protect the Pharaoh.
哇！你諗下啦，有個守衛啊，都係包金嘅，係保護住呢一個嘅法老王。
Much gold over all of this.
哇！你諗下，全部都係金嘅。
Here's the goddess Hathor, the cow goddess Hathor, protecting a treasure with the entrails, with the insides of the king.
哇！你諗下，呢度有隻牛神，專係保護呢一個嘅法老王嘅內臟。
They found also the throne, the chair, his throne chair.
你諗下，又見到佢嘅王座喎。
And remember, Dr. Hazel was telling us about the serpent,
記唔記得頭先我哋嘅考古學家就講到一條蛇啊？
the winged serpent.
咁見到啊，我哋睇到呢一個嘅蛇係有翼嘅。
The serpent was played the function of the protector of the king.
原來佢當時嘅功能就係要保護呢一個法老王。
And you can see that right here. This is called a cartouche with the name of the king.
呢個大家認唔認得？原來就個法老王嘅名嚟嘅。
And you see the serpent's wings in a protective stand.
咁你見到啦，呢一個嘅蛇有翼嘅蛇就保護住當時嘅皇帝
Of
法老
course,
王。
this was made of gold also.
金做嘅，
It was a magnificent find.
哇！真係好特別奇妙嘅發
They
現。
found the mask of the king with both the vulture and the cobra.
佢見到呢個皇帝呢一個嘅面具裏邊呢，佢係有一個眼鏡蛇同埋一個禿鷹。
When the Pharaoh was alive, it only had the cobra.
原來呢個法老王當佢仲係生存嘅時候呢，就係只係有一個眼鏡蛇嘅冠
When
嗰
the
度。
Pharaoh died, they put the vulture.
而皇帝呢個法老王死咗之後呢，佢就會加多個禿鷹喺上面，
They also represented Upper and Lower Egypt.
亦都係代表呢一個嘅上半橛嘅呢一個嘅埃及同埋下半橛嘅埃及。
Notice the cobra here is in a striking form, ready to strike back.
嗱，你留意下呢一個眼鏡蛇，佢係攻擊人咁嘅樣，係保護個法老王嘅。
That's why it was the protection of the king.
所以我哋就話呢一個嘅眼鏡蛇就係保護呢個法老王嘅。
They found 143 amulets
Kaya-
on his body.
佢身上面咧發現有143個護身符咁多喎，
Each of them representing different things.
每一個護身符有特別嘅意義嘅。
Here's Howard Carter examining the body of Tutankhamun.
你睇下佢就當時呢個考古學家就喺度研究緊呢一個嘅遺像，呢個法老王。
And it may be hard to see, but there is a cobra, snake, around the king's neck because it was to protect his breathing.
原來呢一個咧，你睇真啲，原有一條嘅眼鏡蛇係保護住個皇帝呼吸添喎。
And here's a replica of what that casket might have looked like. This is the outer casket.
咁你睇下啊，呢一個就係呢一個嘅法老王嘅棺木，呢個係最出邊嗰一層。
There were 4 caskets, and the body was in the innermost
而
casket.
一共有4層咁多，個身體咧真正就喺最裏邊嗰一欄啊。
And that coffin, that casket was solid gold inlaid with obsidian and lapis lazuli. Beautiful
原來呢
work.
一個嘅咁樣嘅一切咧，係全部係真金，同埋有好多其他嘅寶石。
Here's a close-up of the cobra and the vulture.
你睇下啦，近距離睇到呢一個嘅禿鷹同埋呢個眼鏡蛇。
Now, throughout history, many people were interested in Egypt because it was fascinating.
其實喺人類歷史裏邊咧，好多人係對於呢一個嘅埃及好有興趣嘅。
One of the most influential people was Napoleon, who 200 years ago took entire expeditions of people to Egypt.
咁大概喺200年前呢，就係呢一個拿破崙咧，就帶咗好多專家就去到埃及嗰度。
And he went with cartographers, and he went with geographers, he went with architects, he went with painters.
佢帶咗好多個攝影家啦、考古學家啦、畫家啦、科學家一齊去嗰度地方。
Because he wanted to map out what he found in ancient Egypt.
佢就希望可以能夠研究發現究竟裏邊究竟有啲咩其他嘅寶藏喎。
One of the greatest finds in Egypt was the Rosetta Stone.
而其中喺呢個地方發現一個好寶貴嘅咧，就係羅塞塔石碑。
The Rosetta Stone stands to about this height.
大概係咁高度啦。
It is written it's in the British Museum, and it's written in 3 languages.
咁今日咧就藏喺大英博物館喺英國裏邊啦，就有3種嘅語文裏邊寫出嚟嘅
Hieroglyphics,
象形文啦、
Demotic,
通俗體
and Greek.
同埋希臘文係一樣嘅。
Now, hieroglyphics is a symbol-like language.
咁呢一個第一個咧就係話用一啲嘅圖畫係代表嗰啲嘅意思。
Demotic was another Egyptian language, the equivalent of cursive for Western writing.
咁通俗體亦都係埃及文嚟嘅噃，就等同今日英文嘅呢一個嘅呢個草書。
Of course, at that time, nobody could decipher either one of those 2 languages.
咁當然嗰陣時咧冇人識呢啲文字代表咩意思，完全唔懂嘅。
But the fortune was to find a rock, a stela like this, with Greek on it.
但係好好嘅話咧，就係因為佢哋揾到呢一嚿石裏面下邊係有希臘文。
People knew Greek, knew how to read Greek,
因為
ancient Greek.
因為啲人識希臘文啊嘛，咪知道其他嘅意思係點樣咯。
Hieroglyphics were typical and identified the Egyptians.
原來當時佢哋見到嘅象形文字咧，就非常之係典型嘅，係代表呢一個埃及。
When you go to Egypt, to Luxor, for instance, and you see some of these great palaces, hieroglyphics everywhere.
嗱，大家如果去過埃及咧，你見到周圍都見到呢啲嘅象形文字。
And of course, they all tell a story.
咁當然每個象形文字嘅故事都係講出嚟嘅。
And because the Rosetta Stone had Greek, then that would be the beginning point. Because the assumption was that all 3 said the same thing, all 3
因為佢
languages.
哋相信3種唔同嘅語文都係講同樣嘅內容，所以呢個石頭就話俾我聽好有意思，明白好多啦。
The great linguist that figured the hieroglyphics was François Champollion.
咁其中一個咧就呢度圈住嘅。
And he began by making an assumption about the cartouche. This is called a cartouche.
呢個咧就有一個嘅框框係框住呢個位置。
Remember that I showed you the cartouche in the in Tutankhamun's throne.
我哋頭先講過啦，喺呢個皇帝其中嘅墓穴裏邊都見到咁樣情況。
He made a guess. He guessed that contained something important.
佢就諗下呢個咁樣特別框住係咪有啲特別嘅意思
And he
咧？
guessed that would probably contain the name of a king.
佢諗下可能就係當時記載咗就係一個皇帝嘅名嚟
So
嘅。
little by little, he started piecing things together.
慢慢佢就按部就班就發現裏邊其他更多嘅資料。
Now, you can only imagine how hard it would be to decipher an entire language out of nothing.
但係你諗下，有一啲完全冇線索，點樣可以慢慢明白究竟裏邊發生咩事係好難嘅。
But this man was brilliant.
哇！呢個人係好聰明嘅。
When he was 5 years old, he would listen to stories by one of Napoleon's mathematicians telling him about the wonders of Egypt.
原來當佢5歲嘅時候，佢聽到個拿破崙一個嘅數學家講到呢一個埃及裏邊嘅7大奇景啊等等。
And at that young age, he determined that one day he would go to Egypt.
哇！嗰陣時佢都5歲咋，佢決定我有一日要去埃及。
Well, by the age of 16, Champollion already could speak about 8 or 9 languages.
佢10幾歲嘅時候已經可以講8、9種嘅語文嘞噃。
By the age of 17, he applied to go to the university.
17歲啦，佢就要考大學。
And in order to gain entrance, he needed to write a scholarly paper, a good paper.
咁入學試嗰陣時咧，就要寫一個文章，係咪？
It was very demanding to get into that
因
university.
為嗰個學校係好難入嘅，要寫個論文先入得。
He wrote a paper, I believe it was on the Coptic language, which is an ancient Egyptian language. And not only was he admitted, he was made a professor at the age of 17.
哇！當時佢寫篇嘅文章咧係講關於埃及文喎，所以佢唔淨止入咗間學校，佢直情係俾人哋請咗佢做教授添喎。
By the age of 20, he spoke 12 different languages.
哇！20歲講12種語文咁犀利啊！
So he was the right man for the job.
哇，啱晒佢啦！呢個工作係咪呢？
And by the year 1824, he had deciphered enough so that people could now learn what hieroglyphics could tell.
好啦，1824年嘅時候，佢決定要讓啲人明白象形文字裏邊嘅意思係乜嘢。
You can see that when you go to London, you must go to the British Museum.
記住咯，第時去英國嘅時候，一定去呢一個大英博物館
There are
睇
a
呢
lot
個
of
石碑。
beautiful things there, and that famous Rosetta Stone, the original one, is there.
你就見到個原本嘅呢一個嘅石碑，就唔係
But
呢一
we
嚿
don't
啊
have the original one, but we have a copy.
我哋有一個複製版啊
And it is not as big, but at the end of our lectures today, you're welcome to come and look at these things, take pictures with it if you want
咁
to.
當然我哋嘅真版係比較高大啲啦。完咗今晚散會之後，歡迎大家嚟睇下3種唔同嘅文字。
This is from the Wood Museum, which Dr. Hazel is director of.
咁呢個嚟自我哋嘅主講人，其中佢負責嗰個博物館裏邊嘅其中一個嘅物資。
Now, why was deciphering hieroglyphics, why was that so important? In what way did it really change the course of history?
但點解呢一個嘅石碑係咁重要，係改變咗呢個世界嘅歷史呢？
Dr. Hazel will tell us a little bit about that.
我將時間交俾我哋嘅專家。
The Rosetta Stone was revolutionary for understanding the ancient civilization of Egypt.
呢個羅塞塔石碑呢，係俾咗我哋可以明白古埃及人嘅文化。
It unlocked the history of one of the oldest civilizations.
佢為我哋開解咗，明白到一個古埃及嘅文化。
For the first time, one could read these ancient inscriptions written on temple walls and on papyrus and all kinds of other texts.
咁啊，人類第一次可以明白到古埃及人佢喺嗰啲石碑或者石板或者係嗰啲蒲草紙上高所寫嘅呢啲埃及嘅古文字係咩意思？
What Egyptologists saw was a whole history of kings and conquerors, of a civilization that interacted with the whole ancient Near Eastern world.
咁嗰啲係研究古埃及文化嘅專家，佢哋就可以理解得到、明白得到埃及時代嘅時候，佢哋點樣同佢哋嘅鄰近嘅邦國點樣嘅關係。
And these places that were recorded by the Egyptians were places that were also mentioned in the Bible.
咁啊喺呢啲文字上高記載呢，亦都同時發現到呢，有一啲聖經有提過嘅人物或者係地點呢，係有喺裏邊記載咗。
One monument that was discovered in 1896 was the Merneptah Stela.
喺
1896.
1896年，被發現咗嘅就係呢一塊梅內普塔石碑。
It dated back to 1200 BC, 1209 BC, about 3,200 years ago.
相信係喺公元前1209年所造成嘅。
And it mentioned for the first time in history the ancient people of Israel.
第一次睇到喺埃及人嘅文字裏邊提到聖經裏邊以色列嘅民族。
It mentioned the Israelites in Canaan, which meant that the Exodus had to take place before this inscription was written.
咁裏邊有提到以色列人已經有記載咗以色列人嘅民族啦。咁所以咧，即係話咧，佢哋嘅存在咧係喺呢一塊石板做之前。
It mentioned a number of other entities or people groups and nations besides Israel as well.
咁亦都有提到咧，其他喺聖經裏邊提到以色列地嘅人物。
All of these places and all of these people are mentioned in the Bible.
喺呢個裏邊石板上邊都有記載咗呢度所提到嘅呢啲唔同嘅係人。
For the first time in history, one could look at the Egyptian records.
咁第一次咧，人可以從埃及人嘅記載裏邊，
and could compare them with the Bible
然後可以同聖經嚟對比。
and see whether they talked about the same entities.
咁咧就睇下係咪講同樣嘅事實。
Merneptah also left a record on his temple at Karnak.
咁咧呢個咧亦都喺另外一個地點咧，卡納克呢個神殿裏邊咧有一個牆咧係有雕刻喺上高。
There the same names occur. And some believe that Israel is actually depicted on these pictures for the first time in history.
所提到嘅人同埋地點咧，都係同咧喺另外嗰個石板上高所記嘅一樣，而且咧呢度咧仲有繪圖咧，好似睇到咧係以色列人喺呢度。
But the Egyptians mention nothing in their records about an exodus from Egypt.
但係喺埃及嘅歷史記載裏邊，從來冇提過有呢個以色列人係離開呢個埃及。
The Bible has this as a very important event in biblical history.
喺聖經裏邊，呢個出埃及嘅事件係一個好重要嘅一個事件。
But it shouldn't surprise us that this is not mentioned in the Egyptian records.
但係喺埃及嘅記錄裏邊就冇，咁我哋都唔一定要好驚奇佢點解唔喺嗰度。
If we read the biblical account, this was the most devastating event that happened in Egyptian history.
咁如果你有睇咗聖經裏邊記載出埃及呢個事件嘅時候，你就知道喺呢件事情發生嘅時候咧，係埃及最唔好嘅時候啦。
The 10 plagues would have destroyed the Egyptian economy.
聖經有記載到有10大嘅災難，咁呢10大嘅災難咧就影響咗當時埃及嘅呢個民生。
They were a judgment against the gods of the ancient Egyptians and their ideology and their religion.
呢個10大嘅災難就係證明咗神係點樣去講到埃及人所信嘅神嘅唔真確。
And reading the Egyptian texts that we have today, we know that the Egyptians never admitted that they were defeated in any battle.
咁我哋如果睇到埃及人嘅記載咧，自己咧就從來都唔會講俾人哋打敗仗啊，或者係做得唔好嘅嘢嘅。
The Egyptians were always victorious.
佢哋成日寫自己都係打勝仗嘅。
So this is not surprising that this is not recorded in Egyptian history.
所以我哋應該唔係話好驚奇咧，點解佢哋冇提到呢個出埃及呢個事件？
What we want to do this evening, though, is we want to compare what the Bible has to say about what happened and look back at Egyptian history to see how this connects with the life of Moses.
今晚我哋想攞啲時間嚟比較一下埃及嘅歷史同埋聖經嘅歷史。
According to the Bible, it was Moses that led the people out of Egypt.
咁按照聖經嘅記載，係摩西帶領以色列人離開埃及。
God had promised the people of Israel a promised land.
上帝應許咗以色列人一個應許嘅美地。
There's a text in the Bible many, many years later that help us date this event of the Exodus in history.
喺聖經裏邊有咁樣嘅記載，幫助我哋可以重組呢個事件。
It's found in 1 Kings 6:1, and I will read it. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord.
喺列王記上6章1節有咁樣嘅記載，以色列人出埃及地後480年，所羅門作以色列王第4年，西弗月就是2月，開工建造耶和華的殿。
Solomon's temple, according to this text, we know when Solomon lived. We can go back in time, so we can guess that Solomon's temple was built in 970. We know that for a fact. We can go back from there 480 years.
咁從歷史嘅記載，我哋知道所羅門開始建造聖殿，大約喺公元前970年開始建造。
So the text places the Exodus 480 years before the temple was built.
咁呢度提到聖經嘅記載話，喺所羅門王建造聖殿之前嘅480年，就係以色列人離開埃及。
Looking at this graph, we can date then the Exodus back around 1450 BC.
咁所以呢，我哋可以推想到，如果所羅門王建造聖殿係公元前970年，而推返去480年呢，咁即係話以色列人離開埃及呢，就應該係喺公元前1450年左右。
We know that Moses was 80 years old when the Exodus happened, so he had to be born around 1530 BC.
按照聖經嘅記載，我哋知道當時摩西係80歲，所以如果再推後80年，咁摩西就應該係喺公元前1530年出生。
So this helps us look at what was happening in Egyptian history as we receive the chronological information from the Bible.
咁所以我哋可以從呢啲歷史嘅推想上高咧，時間推想上高咧，就可以明白到埃及人當時嗰個歷史係點樣。
Moses would have been born during the reign of Thutmose I in the 18th dynasty.
咁所以咧，如果喺嗰段期間摩西出生嘅時候咧，就應該係喺埃及人法老王當時咧就係圖特摩斯一世。
There was a major problem during this time that affected the dynasty of Egypt for the next 3 generations.
咁喺當時咧，有一件好危機嘅事情發生咗，影響咗咧以後3個王朝嘅事情。
The chief queen was not having male heirs, was not having boys.
按照歷史嘅記載，當時嘅女王皇后就冇生到男丁。
And it was men that were to inherit the throne of Egypt.
咁當時埃及人嘅社會就係以男人係作皇帝。
Thutmose I's wife, chief queen, was Ahmes.
咁所以咧，圖特摩斯一世嘅皇后咧就係亞摩斯。
And they didn't have any sons.
但係佢哋咧就冇生到男丁。
But they had a very famous daughter.
但係佢哋有一個好出名嘅公主，
Her name was Hatshepsut.
就係哈謝普蘇。
And Hatshepsut was a very important princess in ancient Egypt.
咁哈謝普蘇呢一個公主咧，喺埃及嘅古代嘅歷史咧，係一個好重要嘅人物。
Some people believe it was Hatshepsut that rescued Moses from the Nile River when he was placed there by his mother.
有人相信就係呢一位哈謝普斯嘅公主咧，係救咗摩西嘅命。
You remember what Exodus chapter 1 verse 22 says? Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.
你記得喺出埃及記1章22節裏面提到，法老吩咐他的眾民說：以色列人所生的男孩，你們都要掉在河裏；一切的女孩，你們要留存他的性命。
So when her father, Thutmose I, died,
咁當呢個哈謝普蘇公主嘅父親，即係過身嘅時候，
the question was who would be the next king?
咁邊個接任做皇帝呢？
Well, Thutmose I had another wife or consort.
咁但係呢個圖特摩斯一世，佢有其他嘅妃嬪。
And they had a son, the half-brother of Hatshepsut.
咁咧就生咗一個男丁，就係呢個哈謝普蘇公主嘅細佬啦。
And in order to maintain the dynasty, that son was forced to marry Hatshepsut.
咁咧喺古代嘅埃及咧，細佬咧就可以同個阿姐結婚。
But he was a very sickly man.
咁但係呢個咧圖特摩斯二世啦嚇，即係細佬啦，佢係一個好係有病嘅人。
He didn't live for very long.
佢唔係 活得好耐，
And he died before producing a male heir.
但係喺佢死之前呢，都冇生到男丁，
Not with Hatshepsut anyway.
冇同哈謝普蘇呢位公主生咗
Who would
男
be
丁。
the next king?
咁邊個做下一任嘅皇帝呢？
Well, he had another son by another secondary wife.
咁啊，呢位圖特摩斯二世呢，亦都有其他嘅妃嬪，其中同一位就生咗一個男丁。
But he was just a baby.
咁但係呢個男丁呢，就係圖特摩斯三世，咁但係佢係一個好細嘅嬰兒啫。
When his father died, maybe he was 2 or 3 or 4 years old.
咁所以喺佢嘅父親二世過身嘅時候呢，呢個三世呢，只不過係2、3歲。
So Hatshepsut became the king of Egypt.
所以哈謝普蘇呢，就變成呢係攝政嘅攝政皇后啦，垂簾聽政啊！
Thutmose III couldn't rule at the age of 2 or 3.
咁啊，呢位三世呢，佢得2、3歲就冇可能管理嘅國家嘅。
But when he became of age, Hatshepsut would not allow him to become king.
但係到三世呢，長大咗啦，成年啦，可以管理國家啦。但係呢，呢位太后啦就係唔俾翻嗰個權位俾佢。
She formed a co-regency with him.
咁佢咧喺嗰度咧就繼續嘅攝政，
And she maintained her position.
咁佢係保留咗自己嘅權力。
Some people think that she maintained her position because perhaps she was holding out for somebody else to become king instead of Thutmose III.
咁有人認為咧，可能佢點解要把持住呢個朝政咧？就因為可能佢有另外一個人選或者喺三世之後揾個另外一個人嚟做。
But before we try to answer that question, let's ask another question. Why would an Egyptian princess adopt a Hebrew baby boy?
咁就喺我哋解答剛才嗰個問題之前咧，我哋先問一下，點解一位埃及嘅公主會收養一個希伯來嘅男嬰呢？
Why promote him to be the king of Egypt?
點解要考慮將佢推上去做埃及嘅王呢？
Dr. Cluzet, share with us a little bit of insight into this mystery.
庫斯博士講解一下啦。
There's an expression in English that says, desperate times call for desperate measures.
哇！咁我哋知道有一個英文咁講，喺危急嘅時期一定有啲特別好嘅解決方法。
Dr. Hazel has described to us the dynastic crisis in the 18th century, in the 18th dynasty.
咁啊頭先講到啦，埃及嗰陣時佢冇後嗣喎，可以做法老王點辦呢？
You could not get a true male heir from the real queen.
你冇辦法喺呢一個真正嘅皇后裏邊有一個男丁可以繼承呢個皇位，點辦呢？
The closest you could get was Hatshepsut, but she was a female.
佢可以揾到嘅咧就係頭先講到呢一個嘅公主，但佢係一個女性啊嘛。
But notice that in the picture of Hatshepsut, she has a little goatee.
你有冇見到啊？佢呢一個嘅圖畫裏邊係點樣高 T？
In that Dr. Hazel called her a king.
然後頭先嗰幅畫裏邊咧，就係佢下邊有啲嘅特別嘅鬚啊，佢係一個皇帝嘅身份嚟嘅。
Because the pharaohs were supposed to be male.
原來因為呢一個法老王應該就係男性嚟嘅。
But evidently she was a very skilled woman, and she wore the goatee as a saying, I am the king.
既然佢唔係一個男性咧，佢就有呢個特別嘅裝束呢一個咁嘅胡鬚同埋金牙，就話我係一個皇帝，法老王。
You see what happens is, remember what I said about the Nile.
我哋記唔記得頭先講過呢個尼羅河？
The Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt.
而呢個就係埃及嘅生命之河。
Here you see Hapi, the god of the Nile, tying the Nile together Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt.
你見到呢個嘅尼羅河嘅神咧，佢將上埃及同埋下埃及佢哋一齊綁住。
The Egyptians considered that everything that had life would come from the Nile.
然後佢哋相信所有嘅生命咧係嚟自呢一個尼羅河。
So you have a princess who finds all of a sudden a baby coming on the Nile.
哇！你諗下呢個公主喺呢個尼羅河突然間見到個嬰孩喎。
And she must have wondered, is this a gift of the God of the river god?
哇！係咪呢一個嘅生命嘅神將呢一個 BB 送俾我做禮物咧？
Maybe Happy is being gracious to me.
啊，可能呢一個河神對我真係恩待啦。
Now remember, this is not simply hypothesis. We're talking about a time factor that coincides perfectly with the story of the time of Moses.
嗱，呢一個我哋唔係假想出嚟，而係有歷史證明，就係話當時佢呢個故事發生嘅時候，亦都係摩西嘅時候。
Exodus 2 says what happened, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, and said, because I drew him out of the water.
然後呢個聖經裏邊就講到孩子漸長，婦人把他帶到法老嘅女兒那裏，他就作了他的兒子，他把孩子起名叫摩西，意思就係話因我將佢從水裏邊拉出嚟。
Moses in Egyptian really meant son of or descendant of.
原來呢個摩西原文嘅名嘅意思就係話係某某嘅孩子兒子。
So the name Moses or part of that name was in many people's names, actual names.
咁所以呢一個咁嘅名咧，就係好多其他名都會用到摩西呢個字，但睇喺前面係加咗乜嘢嘅前面嘅名。
Listen to all the names of all these pharaohs.
你睇睇我哋喺熒光幕裏邊咧，係法老王嘅名。
Ahmose and Thutmose and Ramses.
你見到唔同嘅法老王嘅名喺呢個熒光幕上。
You see the portion of the name of Moses in each of them.
你見到摩西嘅名咧，就喺佢所有嘅名裏邊咧都出現咗。
But of course you have another portion.
但係問題佢個名咧就有前半橛喎。
You have what is called the theophoric content or element.
原來佢哋將呢一個嘅神嘅一啲嘅名咧加喺呢一個Moses 呢個摩西嘅名嘅前面。
Theo comes from the Greek word that means God.
然後呢個 Theo 呢個字代表佢哋係將其他嘅神嘅名係加落去後半橛嘅名。
So you see and Tut and Ra, all those were gods.
原來前面嗰啲幾個字咧，全部都係代表神。
So when somebody is called Thutmose or Thutmoses, it means descendant of the god Tut.
原來佢如果叫做圖特摩西一嘅話，即係話我係圖特嘅兒子。
But interestingly enough, she called him Moses, but not Moses or Thutmoses.
但係好特別喎，呢個公主改佢嘅名就係摩西，冇將任何嘅其他嘅神嘅名係冠喺前面。
Because that was still to be decided, most likely, in her mind.
因為可能嗰陣時佢諗下應該改咩名俾佢咧？
She simply called him Moses. It's like the basic element. We will see what God he takes after.
原來佢就俾一個最基本嘅名，諗下以後再冠以乜嘢神嘅名喺前面。
But notice what the Bible says about Moses.
等我哋睇下聖經裏邊點講到呢個摩西嘅人物啦。
In the New Testament book of Hebrews, it says, by faith, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin for a season. So to suffer with his own people, instead of Moses or Thutmoses or Ramses, Moses, the son of the nameless one, the nameless God.
原來呢度咧就係聖經裏邊講得好清楚，個摩西因着信就唔肯稱為法老女兒嘅兒子，佢寧可同上帝嘅百姓係同受苦難， 也唔願意暫時享受呢個罪中之樂。佢話唔做，即係話我唔要做任何嘅神嘅兒子，而係一位無名氏嘅兒子，就係一位我哋冇稱號嘅呢一位嘅神嘅呢一位嘅兒子。
The Bible, the New Testament says that Moses was a mighty man in deed and word.
原來聖經講到呢個摩西係一個無論佢嘅行動、佢嘅説話都係一個好出眾嘅偉人。
Evidently, he was very talented and very skilled as a leader.
你諗下，佢係一個好出眾嘅一個領袖嚟嘅。
Something he demonstrated later on.
以後咧，我哋見到佢事蹟裏邊講到佢真係咁出眾嘅喎。
And the princess must have noticed that, and maybe she was holding out for the possibility that this Hebrew boy could be the next Pharaoh.
可能呢個當時呢個養母就諗下呢個咁出眾嘅樣子，以後可能就成為呢一個法老王。
Now there is something else from the stories of Egypt that are intriguing and have intrigued scholars.
咁另外一樣嘢，聖經裏邊咧令到啲嘅學者好有興趣知道，就係其中一樣係咩事呢？
When Israel was captive under Egypt, they were forced to make bricks with straw and mud.
然後呢一班嘅叫做以色列人呢，佢哋係做奴隸喺埃及嘅時候，係被逼要做一啲嘅磚頭。
But scholars could not find any equivalent in ancient history of bricks being made with straw.
而呢個咁嘅磚頭咧係用呢個稻草嚟做，但係學者話邊度有咁嘅用草嚟做磚？
So many doubted the story of the Bible.
佢哋諗下聖經講嘅故事係咪真㗎？
Dr. Hazel, come and tell us a little bit more about that and how that was resolved.
可唔可以請你介紹下係咪真係可以有草嚟做嘅磚呢？
Europeans did not build their houses with bricks made with straw.
西方人唔會用稻草嚟做磚嚟起屋，
And so they doubted the biblical story.
所以佢哋就好懷疑聖經所講呢個事情。
But archaeological evidence has given new insights into this question.
但係考古學嘅發現有新嘅思想。
In Papyrus Anastasi I, a document, an ancient Egyptian document, it says, I am without equipment. There are no people to make bricks, and there's no straw in the district.
草紙上高所寫嘅呢度提到話，我沒有任何裝備，沒有人去做磚，那地區也沒有稻草。
These depictions here that you see actually are people making bricks, and the piles that you see are piles of straw.
咁你可以睇到咧，呢度咧圖畫上高咧就係記載咗啲人咧點樣起呢個磚，咁嗰度有一堆起嘅一堆嘢咧就係稻草嚟嘅。
They made bricks with straw, and we can still see it in the ruins that we excavate today.
咁喺今日嘅考古發掘嘅時候咧，喺有啲古蹟嘅地方咧，你睇到佢牆所用嘅磚咧，裏邊真係有稻草嘅。
What did the Israelites make out of bricks with straw?
咁以色列人點樣用稻草嚟做磚呢？
The Bible tells us that they made store cities, storage facilities to store goods.
佢哋聖經記載，佢哋有辦法起一啲係儲備稻草嘅地方。
Here in ancient Egypt, we have found some of these store places.
咁我哋喺埃及咧呢個地方咧揾到類似就係咁嘅地方，係裝稻草嘅地方。
This is made out of mud brick.
咁呢個咧係用呢啲係泥磚所造成嘅。
And that is my hand.
咁嗰隻咧就係我哋博士嘅手啦
Same watch still today.
戴住今日嗰隻錶一樣嘅冇假嘅。
And I am pointing at straw that you can still see in the bricks after 3,200 years.
我喺嗰度指俾你睇嘅就係你可以喺嗰啲泥磚裏邊仲睇到有稻草喺裏邊。
People still today in Egypt build in the same way that they have for 3,000 years.
今日喺埃及嘅人咧，現代咧，佢哋都仲係用呢種方法做呢個泥磚。
Up and down the Nile River, people are still building their houses with bricks and they're mixing in with straw.
喺尼羅河旁嘅呢啲屋咧，而家嘅人咧都仲係用稻草嚟做泥磚起屋。
Nobody today questions this biblical account.
今日唔會再有人係疑問呢一個事實啦。
But Hatshepsut was a much greater builder than simply building out of bricks with straw.
呢位哈謝普蘇嘅女皇帝咧，佢所做嘅就唔單止淨係用稻草嚟做啦。
She was an amazing builder who built great palaces and temples.
佢起咗好多好偉大嘅建造物。
And she built the famous temple at Deir el-Bahri.
咁佢亦都喺呢度睇到佢建造咗呢個代爾埃爾巴哈里廟。
Other architects would model their temples in Egypt after this temple for the next 400 years.
咁以後嗰啲法老王咧，400年之後咧，都係跟住佢呢個模式去起佢哋嗰啲廟。
At this temple, there is a chapel, a small temple on the side that is dedicated to the goddess Hathor.
喺呢個神廟裏邊咧，有一個細嘅一個會堂啦。咁咧就係有一埲牆咧係刻咗特別係記載一位神。
And in this chapel, there is something very strange that we see.
咁就係呢一個牆上高所記載咧，呢一個叫做哈托爾女神。
We see the cow goddess Hathor here in this picture.
咁咧喺呢度咧，你可以睇到喺右邊呢度，好似一隻牛咁嘅樣嘅咧，就係代表咗呢個哈托爾女神。
And we see Hatshepsut underneath the cow.
咁你睇到咧，就係咧呢個咧女皇帝咧，就喺嗰個牛族嘅下邊啦。
She is receiving sustenance from her mother, the goddess.
佢喺嗰度咧，係從佢呢位嘅女神嗰度咧，係吸取呢個養分。
This is a very important legitimation scene where she is saying, "I am the divine descendant of Hathor."
所以喺呢個圖裏邊咧，意思就係咧，呢位女皇帝咧，佢話我係可以做女皇帝。因為我係從呢一位女神嗰度而生嘅。
I am the rightful heir and the rightful king of Egypt.
我係有咁嘅權力去接受呢個委任做呢個女皇帝。
But something terrible happens to Hatshepsut.
但係對於呢位女皇帝以後發生嘅事情都係好不幸。
She dies prematurely.
佢死早即係離世。
We don't know why she dies.
唔知道點解咩原因佢離開咗呢個世界。
Just in the last few years, her mummy has been found.
只係喺近期幾年，佢嘅木乃伊先至被發掘到。
And very detailed forensic studies have been done on her mummy, analyzing what causes of her death there might have been.
咁咧，佢哋咧就驗屍就睇到咧。佢係乜嘢原因致死
She suffered from the same kind of lifestyle diseases that we still suffer today.
佢致死嘅原因咧，都係同我哋現代人影響健康嘅生活嘅原因。
The MRI scans indicate that she actually had diabetes.
呢個照到佢咧，佢係有呢個糖尿病。
That she suffered from atherosclerosis, that she had heart disease.
咁佢亦都有呢個心臟嘅病。
And that she was obese.
咁佢亦都係肥胖。
And these are all indications of something else we read in the Bible about the diseases of the Egyptians that the Bible talks about.
咁聖經裏邊都有記載其他埃及人嘅病。
But something happens to Hatshepsut.
對於呢位女王有一個好特殊嘅臨終嘅時候
，She dies，
佢死亡
，and her image is erased from all of her temple walls。
佢嘅所有刻在記載佢嘅形象嘅圖畫咧，都被係咁抹去。
The question has arisen: Who would do such a thing？
邊個會咁做咧？
And the answer that is often given by scholars is Thutmose III.
咁當然啦，嗰啲專家就話就係因為係嗰個圖特摩斯三世啦。
Thutmose III, who was kept from being the ruler of Egypt by Hatshepsut.
咁你記得呢個三世佢細個嘅時候，一路到成年，佢做皇帝都被嗰個大女王咧係撳住佢。
After her death, he becomes king.
所以當女王過世之後，三世就當位啦。
But it is 20 years after her death that he begins to erase her image. 20 years later.
係喺女王死咗20年之後，三世先開始將佢所有記錄佢有關呢個女王嘅嘢咧，係毀滅。
At the very end of his life.
就係喺佢臨終之前做咗呢件事。
Why would he wait so long to discredit his predecessor?
點解佢要等咁耐先至做咁嘅事情呢？
And the answer is given by one very important scholar from the University of Chicago.
咁咧喺芝加哥大學裏邊有一位教授有咁樣嘅意見。
Perhaps there was a rival to the throne.
可能當時有另外一個人可能會做到皇帝嘅。
Someone from the original bloodline that Hatshepsut belonged to.
可能有一位當時係呢個女王係膝下嘅一個王子，可能可以做皇帝。
This would coincide very nicely with the story of Moses.
咁呢個就同聖經所記載呢個女王拯救咗摩西呢個故事呢，係可能有啲關係。
He went into exile for 40 years.
你記得摩西被離開咗埃及之後，佢喺曠野裏邊漂流咗40年。
But then he is called back to Egypt.
然後佢就上帝呼召佢翻去呢個埃及。
To declare the freedom of the Israelites, and the Exodus event took place.
就同當時嘅法老王講，以色列人需要自由。
Could this be the Moses? Could that be the rival?
可唔可能當時呢個三世所忌怕嘅另一位可以做皇帝嘅人，就係摩西呢？
Astonishing discoveries in Egypt which unlock mysteries that are very old. Dr. Cluzet, share with us a little bit more about these ancient mysteries as we
喺埃
close this
及發
evening.
生呢啲咁驚訝嘅發現，對於封閉咗嘅奧秘，請我哋嘅博士再嚟同我哋分享。
You probably have figured that we are trying to go as quickly as we can.
大家可能發現呢，我哋盡快全速向前進啊！講解。
When we do this in English, we take about an hour and 20 minutes in English alone.
如果淨係全英文嘅啦，都要1個鐘頭20分鐘先講完啊！
But of course, we couldn't do that with translation. It would be too long.
咁我因為有翻譯啦，所以我哋又壓咗啲時間咯。
So we had to cut and leave some things
啊
behind.
所以好多內容裏邊呢，我都係剪掉，冇機會同大家分享啊！
And I see that the temperature has gotten cooler.
我發覺咧，好似越嚟越凍喎，係咪啊？
And some of you are getting cold.
大家咧都好似打冷震啦，係咪？
So it's time to let you go.
即係話係咪要翻屋企啦？
Well, let me finish with this prophecy found in the Bible.
我哋睇睇聖經裏邊老早點樣講咗呢啲説話咧。
This great civilization, these marvelous buildings, you would think that that would stand forever.
可能我哋當時會以為呢啲咁壯大嘅啲建築物可以永遠咁存留，係咪咧？
Many people have asked the question, why has Egypt come to nothing compared to the great glory days of the past?
當我諗下，點解埃及同以前比較，今日唔可以有存留呢個光輝嘅歲月啦？
Well, the prophet Ezekiel had prophesied about Egypt.
原來聖經裏邊有個以西結裏邊咧就講到埃及將來嘅命運係點嘅。
And this is what it says in Ezekiel 32.
我哋睇睇啦。
By the swords of the mighty warriors, all of them the most terrible of the nations, I will cause your multitude to fall. They shall plunder the pomp of Egypt, and all its multitude shall be destroyed. I make the land of Egypt desolate.
呢 呢個是以西結呢個先知老早就講咗啦，話我必藉着勇士嘅刀，令你嘅眾民仆倒。呢個勇士都係列國中強暴的，他們必使埃及的驕傲歸於無有。我使埃及地邊為荒廢凄涼嘅。
So God prophesied through his prophet that Egypt would crumble.
原來聖經裏邊，上帝已經藉着呢佢嘅僕人先知咧，講到埃及命運係咁噶啦。
That it would be overcome by enemies.
原來就喺敵人會戰攻佢哋勝利，
That the treasures of Egypt would be plundered.
而佢哋所有嘅財寶係俾人哋搶奪晒。
And that's exactly what we have seen in
而
history.
今日我哋見到就係應驗咗聖經所講嘅。
It is unique that so many of the tombs in Egypt have been plundered.
所以我睇下今日咁多嘅呢一個嘅金字塔係俾人係奪掠，
And that Egypt could never recover.
而今日咧我哋見到埃及冇辦法再重新係起嚟。
Here's the capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis.
話呢一個就係古埃及嘅首都係曼菲斯。
This is all that is left of that great capital.
哇！你諗下嗰陣時嘅壯大嘅首都，今日變成淨係咁
There are
樣。
plenty of historical records that show that this was a magnificent city once many years ago.
曾幾何時好多嘅歷史證明話呢一個係一個好輝煌嘅首都喎。
But all you have left are a few ruins.
但今日剩翻嘅就係幾嚿嘅爛石。
About a century ago, a little more, there was a British socialite by the name of Amelia Edwards.
咁我哋有一個嘅100年前有一個嘅女士，
She was a rich woman who sponsored many expeditions to Egypt.
佢係一個富有嘅女士咧，佢就係贊助咗好多人去埃及發掘，
She loved Egypt.
佢好中意埃及。
And she eventually wrote the first popular book on Egypt.
佢係第一位以後咧就寫咗一本好出名嘅書，關於埃及。
The book was called 1,000 Miles Up the Nile.
佢就話喺呢個尼羅河係上游100里嘅呢本書名。
And she records with sadness the fate of Egypt.
佢係好難過咁寫落，佢見到呢一個埃及係咁樣係衰敗落去。
Finally, she says about Memphis, this is all that remains of Memphis, oldest of cities, a few rubbish heaps, a dozen or so broken statues, and a name.
佢點樣形容當時好輝煌呢一個首都？就係話呢個係最古舊嘅城市曼菲斯，剩翻嘅係咩？垃圾，十幾樽嘅碎嘅雕像同埋個名啫嘛。
All that is left of Egypt is that great name and that great history.
剩翻個咩？就得個名啫。
Well, evidently, the God of the Bible knew about that.
我哋知道啦，喺聖經裏邊嘅講到個神老早就知啦。
And he was able to prophesy this at the height of Egyptian power and influence.
我哋呢位上帝就喺呢一個嘅埃及全盛嘅時候，佢就預言到將來有一日佢哋咁樣嘅地步啊！
2,600 years ago.
2000幾百年前喎，
Nobody would imagine that. That's like saying today the United States and China will come to nothing and nobody will even remember them.
哇！你諗下嗰陣時埃及咁壯大嘅時候，點會諗到啊？即係好似今日話，哦，美國、中國將來係會沒落嘅，有人信咩？
Well, nobody will believe that because those are the two biggest economies in the world.
而家諗呢兩個國家係世界強國嚟噶嘛？
But that is exactly what happened, as predicted.
但正如聖經所講嘅預言，係全部係應驗咗啦。
So, all we have left is this very insightful text from the book of Isaiah.
但係問題，我哋今日剩留嘅係好重要嘅聖經章節，就係以賽亞書。
The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever.
哇！呢度就話草會枯乾，花亦都會凋謝，唯有上帝嘅話係永遠係立定。
And that's our story tonight.
呢個就係我哋今晚嘅故事。